Hello, Endeavor here. So tonight I'm here with Nicholas R Jeelvy. He's a writer at Countercurrents from Macedonia, and he approached me this week about the recent video that I made on the film The Public Enemy and the role of the mafia in pop culture and the political themes in the mafia. And you should definitely check out that video first. It was one that I thoroughly enjoyed making and one I'm more proud of. And I came down kind of on the anti-mob side. I came down being very anti-mafia. And Nicholas last year wrote an article titled In Defense of the Mafia, or sorry, In Defense of Gangs, on Countercurrents. And I've linked both my video, if you haven't seen it yet, and his article in the description. So if you'd like to get our general positions on these issues, then you can check that out after the stream. But I'll hand it over to Nicholas. So what is your take on the mafia and on gangs, and what would be some of the objections you would make to the video that I released last week?
Well, first of all, let me just say thank you for letting me voice my opinions here. Is very magnanimous of you. And yeah, I've watched your video in analysis of The Public Enemy. Now, I have to admit, I have not seen The Public Enemy, but I do understand the tropes of it, of Public Enemy, just through pop cultural osmosis. And I don't know if many people know this, but there is a magnificent parody of The Public Enemy, which is Johnny Dangerously, I believe. And it's not just a parody of The Public Enemy, but of a lot of mob films. And but the plot structure is basically lifted from Public Enemy. So yeah, I more or less know what's going on in the film. And my objection was you were saying that the mobster, he's not on the side of order. He's just a hoodlum. Well, I got an issue when people say things are just anything. So just a hoodlum. We were talking about the morality of gangsters' actions. I don't know. I think let's think of it this way. People are there is such a thing as good order and evil order. There is I think we can both agree that the order we live on currently, an tyrannical order built by the cathedral, is not a particularly good one. Would you agree with me on that one?
Yes, I would, but I guess I have a more, I separate authority from order, because I think that it is a system that creates disorder. I think that order to me is it's something more metaphysical. It's not necessarily just who is ruling over you. It means stability and longevity, and having certain civilizational structures in place which ensure that longevity and survival and flourishing and things like that. That's what I consider order. So yeah. I wouldn't say that we're simply living under this current order, and that that's an argument in favor of global homo or anarcho tyranny. I'd argue that it's disorder, that what it's bringing about is disorder. So I want to separate the concept of authority, so whoever is in power right now, versus the more metaphysical concept of order.
Right. I mean, we call it anarcho tyranny for a reason. There is a chaotic.
Exactly. It isn't order.
There is a chaotic element to it, but there is also an authoritarian element to it. This is why it's not mere anarchy. It's just anarcho tyranny. So my point is, when we say order, which brings stability and longevity, one question you got to ask yourself, which, our enemies ask ourselves, and they've been consistently winning for, the past 200, 300 years, is longevity for whom, stability for whom, survival for whom. You made a good point in the video that at this time, you're just a poor American, especially one of immigrant background, is basically the loser of the order, of the state of affairs in 1920s and 30s America, especially in 1930s during the Great Depression. I mean, just imagine being some poor Irish guy. You immigrate, you get away from tyrannical order back in Ireland, where you're basically a second-class citizen, and you come to America expecting hope, and then you're thrown into this meat grinder of early stage capitalism, and then the Great Depression hits, and you're out of work. So respecting authority, you're basically seeing the societal elite use order to enrich themselves at your respect. So the question is, why would anyone uphold? So now, before we get into this, maybe we should have said this earlier. I do not want anyone to get this wrong. I don't want you to go out and form criminal gangs or do anything against the law, obviously. We're just a couple of, internet intellectuals having a discussion about the quote-unquote morality of criminality. So, so yeah, whom is the basic question. Whose order, whose stability, whose longevity? And if the order does not ensure my longevity and my stability and the longevity and stability of my people, then why uphold it and its peace?
Well, that's an interesting point, and I want to just say for anyone that if you'd like to make any donations, my channel is demonetized. I've linked Entropy in the description, so that's how you can either support my channel or send any questions you'd like us to answer. It's down in Entropy. So the longevity for who, the order for who, I think that speaks to a certain dynamic that with the history of the mob in the United States that I actually didn't really get into in my video, but maybe I should have. One thing you'll notice is that all these mobsters, there were several big groups several major groups that constituted the mob. There was, of course, the Italian diaspora, the Irish diaspora, and another diaspora that's so powerful and actually probably a lot more significant than people give them the credit for in the history of the mob, that they're so powerful today that I can't even say their name on YouTube. The Tribe. Everyone knows who I'm talking about. What all these have in common is that at the point of the early 20th century America and late 19th century, when these groups started arriving, they were fundamentally aliens to the United States. The United States was a white Anglo-Saxon Protestant nation from its founding until certainly until the early 20th century. And, that started to change both with the immigration 19th century and early 20th century, then certainly after 1965. But these groups were not as loyal to the founding identity of the United States at the time. And from their perspective, yeah, I guess that does make sense, forming ethnic interest groups and, kind of having this mob mentality. And it certainly worked out for the one that I'm not allowed to mention. However, from the perspective of Wasp America, it's really not something that does not benefit them. Ultimately, for Wasp America, the mob was a parasite. It was a cancer upon their traditional society and something that really shouldn't have been tolerated really at all. And I'd say that the United States in the early 20th century, if the order, whose order exactly, that is of white Anglo-Saxon America as it was historically, the mob is against that. And ultimately their goal needs to be upholding their own ethnic interests, really. So I'd say that's kind of why it would have been a negative thing at the time, certainly because, it's undermining the traditional fabric, the founding stock of the country to benefit a newcomer who's in many ways an alien.
Right. I will also point out that historically, two of the tribes we have mentioned, so the Sicilian Mafia actually began as a resistance organization against the annexation of the Kingdom of Two Sicilies by the Kingdom of Piedmont, Sardinia, in order to form the Kingdom of Italy, quote unquote. I mean, obviously, this was an unprecedented subjugation of one people by another. The entire industry of the Mezzogiorno of the south of Italy was dismantled and shipped back to the north. The royal treasury of the two Sicilies in Naples was plucked bare by the Piedmontese, and what was the people and the disaffected elite of the two Sicilies formed this type of organization, the organizations which would later grow into the mafia, to protect themselves against the depredations, first of all, of the Italian state, of the Kingdom of Italy, and also just from plain old bandits, because they saw the Kingdom of Italy as an illegitimate authority. And as to the Irish organized crime, they never lost contact with Irish liberation efforts in the United Kingdom. And indeed, the IRA and later the provisional IRA and the official IRA were bankrolled at all times in part, of course, by the Irish criminal organization operating in the United States and elsewhere. So these organizations, and if we really dived into the history of the third tribe notorious for organized crime, you'd probably find some that it wasn't something that arose in America, but probably arose in the Pale of Settlement where they came from, in opposition, where there were again second-class citizens in the Russian Empire of some sort. So, and yeah, we can see the whole mafia type struggles, organized crime struggles in Prohibition era America and everything as ethnic strife with four sides, three of them being these ethnic tribes who are at various points competing against each other or cooperating with each other, and the fourth side being Wasp America. But then again, are we really ready to throw around words like immoral and unethical with regard to something which is essentially an ethnic conflict? I mean, if two tribes declare war on each other and wage war on each other, I mean, like you said, did you win medals by holding hands with the Germans? Is it immoral or moral for a man to take up a rifle and shoot a man because his nation is at war? And what is organized crime activity but low-level war against what is ultimately a hostile society? It's like the criminal brother, I believe his name is Tom, says to the law-abiding brother in the film, "Did you want to win medals by holding hands with the Germans?" And how is his name Tom, the criminal brother?
Yes.
Yeah.
Tom Powers.
How is Tom's activity opposing the Wasp hegemony any different from the other brother's activity opposing German, hypothetical hegemony? Not that it would have ever reached America or even Ireland. But why is Anglo-Irish conflict illegitimate, but German-Irish conflict on behalf of a Wasp Anglo hegemony legitimate?
Well, because I'm on this. Well, first of all, I think lawfulness is something that's very important in it. It's because I do think that that order really comes through lawfulness. The soldier acts on behalf of a government, so his actions are not necessarily his own, and the soldier can play his role in a stable, ordered society and legally carry out his duty. Now, of course, World War I was a bad war that never should have happened. I agree with that. However, I don't think that it's necessarily an indictment against the individual soldiers who went off and fought in the war, that the actions that they would have had to have taken in the line of duty. Whereas if you contrast that with the mobster, he's really just acting on his own behalf and really I don't think has the same role in an ordered society, because he's really taking and essentially leeching off of a healthy society to enrich himself, and really acting and really committing amoral acts within his own fruition. So I'd say that that's the main difference. But then also, I'm not a universalist. So, from the perspective of America, because I'm not American, but this is the context and under which we're looking at this. From the perspective of the United States,
it's also valid in Canada, right? Don't you also have all of these ethnic gangs plus the Quebecois gangs in Canada?
Yes, but the thing is, though, from the perspective of the foundation, the foundational population, I'm not a universalist. I think that their countries should be run for them. I think that every group should have a country that is run for them for their own ethnic interests. And from that perspective, the mobster is an enemy, very, very different than their own soldier would be going off to fight in a war against a foreign nation. Because I don't want to look at it through a universalist lens. From the perspective of the United States in the early 20th century, someone going off and fighting a foreign country and fighting in a war against a foreign nation is very different from somebody on their own streets breaking their own laws. Because I do believe that I believe in legality, I believe in lawfulness and order, and I think that imposing laws to prevent criminality is legitimate. I don't think that I don't believe that Wasp America in the early 20th century was an illegitimate force, because that's what the left will say today, and I certainly don't think that it's justified for an immigrant who goes there. He was in the film, he was a second generation immigrant, but the fact remains, I don't think that populations which are not of the founding stock, and I know that they've been integrated since then, going there and committing crimes is legitimate at all. Because under that perspective, what's wrong with Black Lives Matter, tyrannizing the UK, for example? It's a racist force against them, according to them. And ultimately, if you actually believe in order and you actually believe in things like self-determination and stuff like that, you would say that that's immoral, because it's a alien group terrorizing a group which should have the right to have dominance over their own land.
Yeah, you could frame it like that, or you can take morality out of it and accept that the history of the human species is the history of tribes trying and failing and succeeding to basically dominate and exterminate each other. Now, I don't want to sound like a leftist here, but the history of, let's say, Anglo-Irish relation is basically a history of Anglo domination of the Irish. So in many cases, the Irish were relegated to acts which would be, of course, illegal, and we, of course, disavow in that sense. But, again, I go back to this interaction between the two brothers in the film. Who is the immoral one? The one who violates the Anglo's laws, or the one who betrays his fellow Irish by cooperating with the Anglo? Understand that there is, of course, this is a conflict as old as European literature. Should I do what is quote unquote good and legal, or should I remain loyal to my people even when they commit what the law considers to be a crime? So yeah, this is maybe the conflict is resolved by each of the two brothers, the Powers brothers, right? I think the last name is Powers.
Yes.
Yeah.
Well, the difference is this, though. Mike Powers identifies as an American. He views his loyalty to the United States. That's why he is so insistent on enforcing order, because he's a second generation American. But ultimately, he wants the United States to be a stable and ordered society for him and his family. His loyalty is not to Irish struggles back in the UK. Not that even supporting Wasp America necessarily would be affecting what the United Kingdom's rule over Ireland at the time, because these are separate governments. But at the same, but ultimately, though, he is enforcing order for what he views as his society, because he is acting on behalf of the dominant culture, which is, of course, he is to an extent an outsider, but is really trying to integrate into it. And I do think that in certain contexts, integration is possible. Of course, there is the ethnic aspect, which would make it very difficult for, say, the African Americans to integrate into Wasp America, because that's just never happened over the course of 400 years. However,
if you're asking me, not even the Irish, Italians, or long-nosed tribe, or even the Germans have fully integrated into Wasp America. If you look at the history of America, you see a major shift in the culture of it, when all of these, there are white ethnic groups, but they still fundamentally change the character of what is essentially an English nation with German and Dutch characteristics. And one of the reasons why, the Italian mafia in particular has captured the imagination of America, but was also such a force majeure for American law enforcement, was because basically there is a hypothesis out there that Anglo policemen had never seen outer Hajnal line type cohesiveness in a gang before. Gang members had always cracked under pressure before, but the Sicilians, who were also kin to each other in many cases, just did not think on each other. And indeed, this was the case up until the back of the mafia was broken in the 80s. So yeah, this is
So the question, but not to quibble over, what is Wasp America? What is the official characteristic of it? I'd say the dominant character of the 19th, that what it would have been in the 1930s. Of course, it had changed to an extent between the 1890s and 1924 due to immigration. But I'd say that by 1931, there certainly was a dominant culture, and that had been altered slightly by the migration from places like Ireland, Germany, Italy, and such. But it was real. It did exist. And the character of Mike Powers, his loyalty is to the dominant culture of America. So he is upholding order for what he considers to be his civilization, really. And then for the other question, that if we're going to look at it just through ethnic struggle, I mean, you can say, well, the Irish who are subverting, well, not really, I don't want to say the Irish are subverting, but it's a different group that's been much more subversive. But the Irish who are kind of like, skirting the rules of Yankee America. I mean, then if we're just going to go, we're going to go with just that, it's just ethnic interest. Well, then what's to stop the Yankee America from just, lining up all these mobsters and shooting them?
That's a very good question, and my answer to that is nothing. I would not be opposed to just grabbing mobsters off of the street and shooting them, or throwing them in prison. And incidentally, while we're on the topic of Italians, there is a certain Italian named Cesare Mori. He was prefect of Palermo during the time of a certain bald former Marxist who did exactly that in Sicily and cleaned up the mob. And we can frame this as ethnic conflict between Northern Italians and Sicilians, but ultimately, I don't think that criminal activity is legitimate when you're doing it against your own people. And I would also say that Wasp America would have been completely justified in rounding up these hostile aliens, and either executing or expelling them. In fact, let's not get into current events.
Let's just say they've been supplanted. They've been supplanted by another group as the elites of America, and afterwards, I can post an article by Sean Last, which is very, which goes into detail the process through which that happened. It's very interesting. But yeah, if we're going to look at it through through this lens, I mean, I take the side of, I mean, from the perspective of the video, I take the side of the United States, its cultural ethnic foundation in the early 20th century, and ultimately what the society really ought to do is what is best for that group. And ultimately, the mobster is an enemy of it. He is the public enemy, as the film would suggest, because his actions are ultimately against that. And I will also point out that the character of Tom Powers, he doesn't really, at least in the film, you don't really see him strongly identifying with things like his Irish heritage or his or the Irish cause back in the United Kingdom. He basically is in it for himself, and in doing so, he actually harms the very people that he really ought to care for. Like the final scene of the movie, there's just something really haunting about a mother like jubilantly preparing her bed for her son, who she expects to come home, only for her other son to open the door and have him fall down dead at his feet. That last scene, for a film in 1931, it's pretty hardcore. So even if you want to go from the perspective of just ethnic interest, I mean, Tom Powers didn't serve the Irish diaspora at all, really, either. He was actually pretty much just lined his own pockets, but really destroyed everything he cared about, and eventually destroyed himself in the process. So, I don't really necessarily think of it. I don't think that the argument that it's just pursuing ethnic interests is even really legitimate here, because even if his loyalty was just to the Irish diaspora, which it wasn't, he would have failed in that respect too.
He obviously, in the film, Tom Powers is not an Irish nationalist. Let's put it that way. He is out to better himself, right? He has been dealt a very bad hand by life, you could say, and this whole notion of the fact of the matter is, men like Tom Powers, there's a lot of them, a lot more than we're willing to admit. His thing is not even that he's in poverty or lacking employment. He's not out doing crime because he's unemployed or poor. And indeed, back when I was involved in criminal justice, most of the criminals you run into, they don't commit crime because they want money or they want an easy buck or they want whatever. They do because they're much easier to ways to make money, lower risk, even more money. And I've met, I've worked as an attorney in the past, like I said, a judge's clerk, and I've met criminals, organized criminals, like not hoodlums, but people who are connected, like wise guys. These are intelligent people, but more than intelligent, these are people with marketable skills. They know how to sell, which is a very rare skill and very easily monetizable one. So you ask yourself, why is this guy not out there selling houses or cars or life insurance? He could make a fortune doing that. Why is he doing this? You realize that, ultimately he's bored. He's like Henry Hill at the end of Goodfellas. Understanding that a life without risk, the bourgeois life without risk, where you retire at 65 and die in bed at 90, is really not for him. And so when Tom Powers is wheeled to his brother's doorstep and keels over, that comes with the territory. You become a criminal. Even you and me, to a certain extent, we are quote unquote thought criminals. We understand that this thing of ours, which is the dissident right, not a criminal organization, it comes with risks. So you accept these risks. And at some level, you understand that you crave those risks. It may be the risks themselves that attracted you, because the alternative is just being a vegetable, more or less, what Bronze Age pervert would call bug life. So it's not just nationalism. It's not just an ethnic cause. It is a desire to feel alive. It is essentially thumos, the driving force of a warrior. And back in the day, such instincts in a man would have been taken by society and directed towards something better, something grand. Like back in the day, people would join the army, and there would be honor in serving in the army. But Tom Powers' society to a certain extent, and our society to a disturbing extent, instead seeks to stamp out the thematic drive of young men and really relegate us to lives which consist of, vegetating, consume, and comply.
Oh, I definitely agree with that, but I don't think that I don't see why criminality would have to be the outlet in order to express something else.
Well, you got any better ideas? You need a way to feel alive. The only way to do that is to routinely expose yourself to mortal risks. And there is a way of doing that. And plus you make a tidy profit. And plus your social status essentially increases because you're a tough guy challenging the government. You've got easier access to women. Why not become a criminal? Obviously, disavow criminal activity. Everyone listening to this, don't do anything stupid.
Well, I mean, like what you see in the film, though, the character of Mike Powers does not need to become a criminal. He goes off to fight for his country, which was considered a noble task by the people, by his family, whether or not you think that World War I was a justified war or not. He works hard to support his mother and to support their family. I think that there's more out there for you to do, and I don't think that criminality is necessarily the answer. And I mean, I guess in regards to the present day, at least from my perspective, I do think that you do want to have a cause or something like that. You do want to have men in particular. They need to kind of have a project. They need to kind of have a cause to go towards, and I think that is what initially drove me towards the dissident right, but I wouldn't say that I necessarily crave danger, so to say. I crave more like is more actually stability and order and things like that. I just think that there is other ways to express it that isn't really criminality. I thought of, and I haven't seen this movie, but I've seen several reviews of it. And I really don't want to watch it because I'm not interested in it. But the film like Joker, I think that other than it being an anti-white film, I think that one of the things that I didn't like about it was that, or at least what I've heard of it, is that basically it suggests that the answer to a crumbling society, to nihilism and stuff, is just to be a complete criminal, be a hoodlum like the Joker became in the film. Whereas I think that the answer is that what the disaffected young man needs today is they need order, stability, guidance, and things like that. And I think that there is a big difference between something in pursuit of order and stability, like the dissident right is for myself, for example. I mean, taking on board these ideas and taking on board that responsibility has made me made me a lot more responsible in my life. I've made a lot of positive changes in the last couple of years. I think that criminality would do the opposite. So I'd say that, definitely young men want that. They definitely want a cause to work towards, but I don't think that the gang is, I don't think that the gang is the answer, really.
Well, first of all, I want to say that Joker does not really suggest that there is an answer. A lot of people who reviewed it, including both Stefan Molyneux and Greg Johnson, agreed that that Joker was just a pain fest, right? It just shows us pain with no exit, and they hated it for it. And I loved it for precisely the same reason, because I think it reflects a little bit on the situation. I'm not as black-pilled as I was back when I saw Joker, but definitely don't look at that. Don't watch that if you're teetering close to the black pill or depression. It can really just do bad things to your psyche, I would say. But with regard to order and stability, I would like to remind you here that the gang is not a bunch of hoodlums breaking stuff and being edgelords by smoking weed and listening to bebop like James Dean does in that film. We are talking about an organization which is ordered, hierarchical, and is bound by what we could call honor and loyalty.
I mentioned that in my video. Yeah.
Yeah, right. So the way I see it, I mean, obviously, I'm guided by this this sentence of Murray Rothbard's. The state is a gang of thieves writ large. Well, the converse is also true. A gang of thieves is the state writ small, and insofar as there is honor among thieves, this is basically a state-type entity, depending on mutual loyalty and mutual protection. A Männerbund, for those of you who prefer the German term, just a gang of men going out and doing things. Now, what makes the state and gang different from other groups of men? Their core competency is violence. So, the state, the best states, the smallest, both the smallest and most legitimate, most powerful states, were the old European feudal monarchies. And these were states composed of warrior elites, essentially, to which we had the church as a guiding and adjacent parallel structure. But the king and his dukes and the lords and everyone, they were essentially warriors. And even the peasants and yeomen, they were called upon in times of war to serve their king. And so the entire state functioned like, quote unquote, stationary bandits. That is the word used by the neo-reactionary thinker James Donald, essentially extracting rents from the population, but also protecting it. This is a protection racket. The main way in which a state or gang-type entity makes money is a protection racket. And this is a term which has been tainted by moralizing and the fact that it is currently illegal for anyone else to do it except the state. But it is a very natural state of being. Safety for resources, a warrior aristocracy, a gang-type entity, a state-type entity, they can provide you with security and stability and ultimately order, but they're going to need something in return. And a gang is exactly, why do young men join gangs? It's because they lack structure in their lives. It's telling that men without fathers or with weak fathers are the likeliest to join gangs. This is because the father is not around to induct them into an existing order. So they go out and seek out father figures, and they find them in the form of gang leaders. And my point is that now we have in the West a very special type of situation where many of us have, quote unquote, no fathers, or at least weak fathers, fathers who are not deserving of respect. And of course, the order that they represent is absolutely not worthy of respect because it actually promotes chaos. The order here being the state, the macro gang. In that case, while I obviously disavow criminal activity, I would not consider it 100% morally wrong to seek out a parallel structure which can provide order and purpose to a young man, given that to young men, order and purpose and belonging to a hierarchy is as nourishing as bread and water.
Okay, so with the last statement, definitely, I would say I agree with that.
Let me just say it a little bit more pithily. At this point, a criminal gang is a greater vector of order and stability than the United States federal government.
I definitely agree with that in today's context. But remember, though, when I was in the video, I kind of wanted to look at it in an abstract context. So First of all, I want to say to Murray Rothbard, I'm a statist. To any libertarian argument, I just reply, don't care, bottom text. So in this theoretical situation, so the state is essentially a gang, and these gangs would be like states within that. Well, then, I mean, from that perspective, I think that the state should view them as kind of like enemy states within, and crush their activity. I mean, maybe if in the mid 20th century, if they had taken that approach, seeing certain gangs and certain elements that acted as gangs within our borders, acting in that manner, and they had just crushed the operations, used the force of the state to crush them, then I think we'd be in a lot better situation in the West than we are today. So in regards to today, I definitely think that if we're going to look at at things like the United States today, or Canada, or pretty much any country in Western Europe. I don't know exactly if I'd say Macedonia this would apply, but
it applies.
Yeah. Okay, it does.
Yeah.
Okay, so the state is a hostile entity. It's ruled by a hostile elite to what I owe loyalty to, that being, European Canadians, and then European people in general. So first of all, I don't think that necessarily a criminal organization is the best way to go, but that's certainly having an interest group and forming things like interest groups and pursuing ethnic interests is the way to go. I certainly would agree with that. I think that it would be important for Americans, or white Americans and white Canadians today, to definitely think of ourselves kind of in the same mindset as some of these gangs in the early 20th century would have had, about pursuing ethnic interests rather than the interest of the wider society. Because, we have to look at the differences that in 1931, the wider society of America was still European Protestant America. Now it's global homo America. The wider society of Canada used to be British Anglo Canada, and then the small province, and then portion of that being French Canadian, and then of course the natives here and there. But no, it's global homo Canada today, and your loyalty does need to be to your own group, and it's not a blind loyalty to the entity of the state per se. But I don't think that necessarily. I don't think that necessarily you need to get that criminality has to be a part of that. I think just having some kind of interest group that acts in your own interest is the way to go. Not necessarily similar to any kind of gang that would have existed throughout the 20th century. Maybe just having the same kind of mindset that it's kind of a zero-sum game that you're in, and you need to benefit your own group, often to the detriment of others. That's kind of just how it goes. But I don't think that. But in an abstract sense, I would say that in a healthy society, gangs would be a cancer, which I think they would have the legitimacy to stamp out.
Well, I would say to that, historically, why did not the United States, the state of America in the 20s and 30s, not crush these para-state organizations, these gang-type organizations? It's the root of it comes from an old joke about an Irish couple, Patrick and Mary, who met on the boat to America, got married to New York, had 12 children, of whom 6 survived, of whom 3 were boys, and the 3 boys were named Seamus, Brian, and John. Seamus became a policeman, Brian became a criminal, and John became a priest. And this is a joke, and it's a stereotype, but it has roots in reality. There is a reason why police vans in America are called paddy wagons. The Irish thoroughly infiltrated law enforcement and local government, whereas another group of which historically has had a major criminal presence in America infiltrated the higher echelons of local and state government, as well as the legal establishment. And then these people who were part of the government gave cover to their co-ethnics who were engaged in criminality. So this is basically the story, and then the Italians just bought their services. The Italians just made a lot of money. They had by far the largest population, but by far the greatest amount of muscle and the most cohesion of every group in America. And they just bought the loyalty of the two aforementioned groups. This is how it's historically went. If it were just hoodlums, the state would have no problem crushing them. That there was a two-pronged attack against Wasp hegemony. The first was illegitimate, criminal activity. The second was subversive, infiltration of local, state, and ultimately the federal government. And then even more importantly, what Mencius Moldbug would call the cathedral, infiltrating the educational, media, and legal establishment of America and turning it towards, among other things, ethnic purposes. But I would say that, in a healthy, homogenous society, gangs wouldn't necessarily be cancer, because you could direct the violent impulses of young men, or not even violent, just thumotic influences of young men towards, good things, towards defense of the nation, towards building stuff. I mean,
well, when we say gang, though, we are talking about like a criminal organization, someone like dealing. I mean,
obviously, if you break the law, you get punished. I mean, when I say gang, I mean a group of men bound by honor whose core competency is violence, and this is the most primitive and least complicated state type entity on the planet.
Yeah, so in response to why didn't they do that, I'll actually read out a comment by Morgoth, which I think pretty much sums it up. He said, "The fault line is the weakness of liberal societies to deal with groups with non-liberal identities networking to exploit or subvert its institutions." That's necessarily the problem. That pretty much sums it up. That's what went wrong. It's that the liberal West in the mid 20th century did not, liberalism prevented it from actually extraditing a real threat, which used liberalism as a springboard to power, but then really was just pursuing ethnic interests and would abandon liberalism the second that it no longer was in that group's own interests. So basically, what I'd say is that the reason that it was allowed to happen is because of liberalism. Really, it's because of not having that, that dog eat dog kind of vision of view of the world, that you have to really defend. You have to defend the foundations of your civilization at all costs, and liberal values should not get in the way of that. Really, and that's why I'm not a liberal. But in regards to in a healthy society, I don't think that there would just be so many more outlets for young men to express masculinity, I think. So, for instance, if
not just masculinity. Look, building a house is masculine. Fixing a car is masculine. I'm talking about specifically violent thumotic urges. Everyone, we disavow violence. We do not do violence. We are intellectuals. We are distant, but we don't do violence. But let's admit that every man, when he was younger, maybe even today, has fantasies about doing, let's call them heroic things, which usually entail, we have fantasized about, defending an old lady from a mugger.
Yeah, I think that is normal for young men to want to do. It's want to be heroic.
Yeah. So these are the instincts I'm talking about. We have also had, not so noble, violent fantasies. There's someone who really annoys you, and you say to yourself, "Well, we really like to fed post him in Minecraft." That's all I'm going to say on the subject. These things exist in every normal man. There are men who don't have these urges. We don't like to speak of them. But we're going to have to build our society of normal men, and normal men have these urges. Not an urge to build a house, not an urge to play sports, but an urge to commit violence, many times for its own sake, because I will say this as someone who has practiced combat sports. Violence is fun, and this is a problem we have. It's the same problem a traditional society would have of wrangling with the sex instinct. Sex is fun, so is violence. I would say violence is even more fun. And young men want to do it, and old men want to do it. And how are we going to turn this titanic human instinct, this deluge of passion and energy, to good ends? So not just
Well, I think there's plenty of
masculinity.
ways to do that. I think that
Yeah,
you could have things like conscription maybe in your society.
obviously.
You could have like a law that that maybe all young men have to serve time in the military, and then maybe they are they're members of the reserve for several years thereafter. You could have things like hunting or boxing, or and even like this is one of the defenses I've made of imperialism and empire in the past is that I feel like men kind of just want to go off and have this like project of civilization, and at the high point of civilization, that's something that they really have the urge to do. Not that I say that that's viable today at all, but I think that there are just a lot of outlets that you can pursue. I don't see, but I don't. Again, though, I don't see why any kind of gang would be necessary for that. Like, I want to separate brotherhood from mafias. Like, I think that you can have all of these things which provide all the same positives that a gang would without it being a gang. Because we have to remember that these gangs, like, they dealt in things like, not like prohibition was just the tip of the iceberg. Like, that was like even though the trade was actually pretty violent, but they did things like dealing in heroin, prostitution. The gangs which were formed by the ethnic group, which I'm not allowed to mention, were very much into prostitution. Just like maybe you could learn about. Maybe that sheds some light on some of the shady things going on today. But I don't think that necessarily the mafia is a good example of an expression of masculinity. If anything, I'd say it's a bastardization of it. It's someone put in the comments of my video that criminality is misplaced masculinity, and I would agree with that. I just think that I'm not disagreeing with necessarily that the urges that men naturally have. I just don't see why the mafia has to be a option for them.
Well, it is a shame that gangs and the mafia are an option. It really is a testament to the decadence of the society. What the mafia generally does to make money is irrelevant. I mean, I look at a Mexican cartel, and they will enforce their monopoly on selling cocaine and marijuana and limes and guacamole with equal zeal. I don't know if you knew this, but the the Mexican cartels make mint on selling and growing limes and guacamole. And back in the day, and I wrote about this in my article on gangs, the Sicilian mafia made a mint really selling genuine olive oil, and not just like a euphemism in The Godfather, real olive oil. They make it and sell it and run protection rackets on olive and lemon orchards back in Sicily. So it doesn't have to be heroin and whores, because the core competency of a gang isn't heroin, isn't whores, isn't limes or guacamole or lemons. It's violence. They have people to grow guacamole and cocaine in Mexico. The cartels just run protection rackets on them. And so basically, and when you look at it, what a gang, like, let's not take the United States, let's take, I don't know, Japan or Germany. Does the German state make cars, or does the German state run a protection racket on BMW and Mercedes and Opel and all of these companies? No, the German state doesn't make cars. The German state only, imprisons old ladies for questioning a certain historic event. But yeah, that's how I look at the quote unquote activities. it's really ephemeral to the organization itself.
Well, I mean, I don't know. I mean, I guess I'm just trying to think of anything like pro-civilization, which which gangs have really done in the past. And I can't really think of that many. I mean, you can look at just all the vices that they did, but then also you have to look at things like a lot of them supported a certain state in the Middle East that is, you know, a lot of us are not very big fans of today. I don't know. I guess that I think that you can a state can do this more effectively and necessary. I'd say having a healthy state run by people who are loyal to the populace who they govern is the best way of advancing that of performing that role. I don't really see. I would imagine that, you know, gangs having to do that. That's more of a that more says that there's something wrong going on than it being an optimal solution, really.
Yeah. I mean, when I think about young men wanting to, Macedonia was for a very long time under the rule of the Turkish sultans. Now, I mean, obviously, a Christian population never really accepted a Muslim ruler as legitimate. But when order broke down in the early 19th century, what happened was a bunch of young men took out their violent urges on the sometimes the Turkish government, sometimes just civilian Turks, and in a very disordered and chaotic manner, which added to the general anarchy of the Ottoman Empire. But then what happened was a revolutionary organization arose in Macedonia, which organized these young men and gave them purpose, gave them structure, and suddenly you had no thuggery against civilian Turks or just young men shooting police officers or, you know, Ottoman police, but you had a very targeted, often with surgical precision, violence against Ottoman authorities. And this was basically a criminal organization, because when you look at how these people funded the cause, they smuggled tobacco, they smuggled diamonds, and at the time poppies, which we also grow in Macedonia, right? And ours are better than Afghanistan's, apparently stronger. And kidnapping, extortion, in some cases mercenary work, you know, hardened haiduks, right? They would be, we call them haiduks, which basically means thieves or bandits. They would work as mercenaries for the Western powers in the colonies, and this is how they would finance the cause of Macedonian independence from the Sultan. And the same organizational model was inherited by the IRA and the groups which later became the Sicilian Mafia, but began as a resistance movement against the Kingdom of Italy. And, you know, as Mencius Moldvad would put it, they are cladistically descended from the internal Macedonian Revolutionary Organization, because those mercenaries I mentioned taught the Irish and Sicilians how to do this, how to you know, be revolutionaries and self-finance, essentially. So I think of chaotic, random violence by young men, and I contrast that to ordered, targeted violence presided over by, you know, a hierarchy, a military hierarchy, essentially, but from a non-state entity, which is nevertheless a state-type entity insofar that it is actually a military organization whose core competency is violence. So, yeah,
well,
that's my general model of what I say gang. Now, obviously, this is couched up in a lot of romanticism, but one thing we got to realize is that tough men aren't nice men, right? And they're very rarely soft men. You know, these are not someone you want to piss off or even just cross in a dark alley. I mean, I would refer to the research done by Dr. Dutton, Dr. Edward Dutton, and Michael Woodley and others about the kind of man who is a leader and a soldier and ultimately a criminal. We talk about physiognomy. I've worked closely with police and with criminals, obviously, in my capacity as an attorney. Physiognomatically, there is very little difference between a cop and a thug. It's basically the same face. It's just that the cops tend to be older.
Well, I mean, what you're referring to is a national separatist movement, which is, in my opinion, very different from a mafia. Yeah, from the perspective of Macedonia wanting to separate from the Ottoman Empire. Yeah, that, I mean, from their perspective, it would make sense because it's a political movement to attain independence, just like the IRA would be the same thing. That to me is not the same thing as the mafia, though. And also from the perspective of the governing force, I could see why they would crack down on that. I mean, I would.
And there were crackdowns.
Yeah, exactly. Like I don't, and from the perspective of say like Mussolini cracking down on the Sicilian mafia, I don't think that what's his name, Cesare Morio or Marie, Cesare Marie. I don't think he. What is it?
Cesare Mori.
Cesare More. Cesare More did nothing wrong. I think that you have to if you're the one governing if you're the governing force in power, I don't think that cracking down on subversion is wrong in the least. But then from your own perspective, of course, I mean that's why they're trying to censor us today, because they realize that the current order is benefiting a certain group and certain different interests, is benefiting the elite, and they don't want us pursuing our own interests, which would pursuing our interests to their detriment. So ultimately it is an ethnic struggle. But again, though, I don't think that necessarily the mafia is the same thing, though. Like the mafia is just a couple guys enriching themselves. It's not necessarily like, I don't think that the Chicago outfit was is an Italian nationalist movement. It was more just a racket to get a lot of money in certain guys' pockets, rather than actually create a political end like say Macedonian independence or Irish separation from the United Kingdom would have been. So I'd say that's the difference. I mean, you can point to
sometimes look, these mafia type entities, when we hear about them, it's because they're successful. And they're usually successful because they have the support of the local population, and they can basically retreat into the homes of the villagers or the citizens to hide from the government. And of course they also have some collaborators in government, obviously. So you got to ask yourself, well, why are the citizens and the government employees and all of these people collaborating with these gangs? Why are they hiding them from the police? And in many cases, historically, when we see these type gangs, you see that the police abandoned these people to petty thugs, to hoodlums. And the mafia, they are criminals. They are obviously extorting the shopkeeper, but they're extorting him at a set rate, at a set schedule. It's basically a tax, as opposed to the hoodlums who break up his store and beat him up and harass his daughters. So because the mafia are organized criminals, they bring order into spaces where, for example, the police has abandoned them. When you look at the south side of Chicago, at least in the 60s, when the black gangs were still strong, well, blacks all over the country rioted because of Martin Luther King. Nobody dared riot in the south side of Chicago because the local black criminal gang was so powerful and hegemonic in that area. Nobody dared start, excrement on their watch. So, and this is really what happened in Macedonia with the internal Macedonian Revolutionary Organization. Really low-level violence and thuggery was cracked down upon, and it was cracked down upon in areas where the Sultan's government could not reach. And basically, this criminal gang which aspired to become a state, was better at enforcing order and just basic decency in many cases than the legitimate government. And this was the same effect that the Chicago outfit had on parts of Chicago. This is the same effect that the Mexican cartels have on parts of Mexico. Mexico, I mean, we're talking about the United States federal government as a weak state. The Mexican federal government is a joke. And the cartels, whatever else they do, they can at least keep the petty hoodlums at bay, too scared to act, or they can actively recruit them and redirect their aggression into activities less damaging. So we are dealing here with shades of gray. I mean, you are comparing the Chicago outfit or the Mexican cartels to a hypothetical, homogeneous, stable, and righteous state, such as the state which managed to root out the Sicilian mafia in the place of its birth, which is unfortunately ideologically anathema today. But yeah, you think about it, how did Cesare Mori manage to root out the mafia? He gave the citizens, who usually gave the mafia a quarter, a fair alternative. Okay, the mafia provides some order. We're going to get you more order. We're going to get you more stability. We're going to be on your side. And then suddenly the mafia had no friends in Sicily. And this is basically the very fact that we have gang-type entities running wild. It means that they have some legitimacy with the population, at least, and entities in the government. So in this respect, they are better than a degenerated and weak state.
Yeah, I would say, though, that the ultimate goal would be the restoration of order and eventually to create a legal ruling order over whatever society is in chaos at the time. So, like you mentioned, Cesare Mori cracking down on the Sicilian mob. Ultimately, what they did was they restored order, like you mentioned, a greater order in Sicily than what the mob was providing, and that really ultimately has to be the goal. Because I remember I heard that I read that the murders in Sicily went down by like 90% or something like that. I don't know the exact numbers, but a crime in Sicily sharply decreased. So I don't think that Mussolini did anything but wrong by cracking down on the mafia in Sicily. From the perspective of the Macedonian separatist movement, ultimately, though, the goal is eventually to create a legal and legitimate governing force over that piece of land that is in the interests of the Macedonian people and not in the interests of the Turkish people. So I do think that it all has to lead towards the restoration of order at some point. I'd say that needs to be the end goal.
I will say that when you're engaged in a separatist movement, this is an attached, but I will say that this is my own personal theory as regarded the history of the insurgency in Macedonia. But I think that the organization really arose more in response to the collapse. At a certain point in the early 19th century, the Ottoman government really lost control of its interior in the Balkan Peninsula, in particular, where with basically gangs of bandits running wild. And I think that the rise of the Internal Macedonian Revolutionary Organization arose in response to the anarchy more than in response to the illegitimacy of the Turkish state. And I think that the anarchy itself was a symptom of the illegitimacy of the Turkish state. I think that any state which allows anarchy in its borders has lost a portion, if not the entirety, of its legitimacy, and is basically begging for an insurgency or criminal type entities taking over parts of its territory. I'm not going to even bring up Chaz because that was not a serious attempt at
Chaz was playing. It was a joke. And it was completely under the permission of the municipal government of Seattle.
Yeah, so let's not even go there. I would say that, I mean, Macedonia, we were under the Turks for 400 years, but we only really gave serious resistance when anarchy came to the fore. So it was really a reaction more against the anarchy of the late Ottoman Empire. And I believe that the weakness of the American state invited the rise of these criminal syndicates. It invited the rise of the Chicago outfit and New York mob and the tribal mob and the Irish gangs when it was beginning to show weakness in the late 19th and early 20th century. And it has invited the rise of black gangs and absolute just black anarchy and cartels and these and of course there are groups of bad actors working within the United States government itself at all levels, which you could also call a type of mafia, although one which has partially captured the state. So yeah, I think that loss of legitimacy, one of its symptoms is anarchy, just lawlessness in the streets, hoodlums running wild, banditry, piracy on the high seas. We might see that one still. And in response, state-type entities, including criminal gangs, out of necessity or out of expediency, arise and introduce some order. So it might be interesting to get a really good look at cartel-controlled territory in Mexico and see if it's more or less orderly than territory controlled by the Mexican government. Obviously, we disavow the activities of all criminal groups and the violation of all laws.
Yeah, another example of that is actually Cape Town in South Africa. It's pretty much controlled by private security companies because the government there is incompetent. The police are incompetent. So basically, the white population in South Africa, what they did was they created all these private security companies, which now basically govern Cape Town. They basically are the police force there. So yeah, I definitely do think that that in a time of chaos, a new entity coming out and restoring order is not necessarily a bad thing. But I guess what I would say is, though, it doesn't necessarily have to be a mafia or something that like deals in wanton criminality or something like that. It can be various different kinds of force, really. So I guess in that regard, we're not too far off, because I would say that, like, in terms of the United States today, like the federal government as it exists is just completely incompetent. It's openly allowing anarchy. It's completely betrayed it's completely betrayed the traditional identity of the United States. And yes, someone coming out and restoring order would be a positive, definitely. I mean, that's what eventually will need to happen. And that's often how states end up breaking up like that. And that may be in the cards for the United States within the next decade or so. But yeah, I definitely would say, though, that some kind of like either ethnic interest group, some kind of organization coming in and restoring order, and people kind of shifting the legitimacy from the failing powers that be to the new one is a positive. It's just I don't know if necessarily they're always going to be mafias that are going to do that. I don't know if that's necessarily the best answer, although in principle, yes, I would say I agree with that, though. Anyway,
I want to clarify that I am really talking about a special case and a special period in the cycle of civilizations, at which point the state is a greater vector of chaos than organized criminals. I mean, like I said, do not compare the mafia as an entity to a homogeneous and healthy state like, let's say, Mussolini's Italy. Compare it to a degenerate, failed state like the United States of Mexico, or a degenerate, failing state like the United States of America. You're better off with Don Corleone than Joe Biden, is what I'm saying. But Don Corleone is not better than, let's say, some good king from history.
Yeah, to that I would agree. But I will say though that like I guess in the original video it was like from the abstract more. It was more if it a stable homogenous society would be best to probably just stamp out criminal elements within it. But in terms of like a time of chaos, yes, a new entity that is able to restore order, be it a mafia or be it any other kind of thing, a rebel group or a I don't know, a liberation army, a new political party, something like that. I do think that would be a positive outcome ultimately, because I am a believer in order. I believe in stability and civilization, and that's what I think needs to what needs to be upheld. The state, that's supposed to be the state's job, but when the state fails to do that, eventually I think that some entity will always come in and restore order, because anarchy does not last. As I think what you can see throughout history is that no state of anarchy has really lasted for very long. Eventually someone comes in and restores order in some way, be it like Napoleon after the French Revolution. Maybe even Stalin could be an example of that in the USSR. Not necessarily a good example, but order always is restored at some point. Anyway,
we saw that Chaz got its first warlord like 3 days in, and I saw that a lot of neo-reactionaries on Twitter were like, "All hail Emperor Raz Simone," and when you look at the S show, which of the DNC and now the RNC, you're thinking, well, is Emperor Raz Simone such a bad idea, really? Give this man an absolute power, and obviously there are, he has got the ethnic impediment, but I will say that in times of crisis, mafia type entities do more good than harm. I vividly remember a video from 2015, which has since been purged off the internet, of migrants on the Isle of Sicily running around causing trouble and then getting cornered by a bunch of wise guys with metal baseball bats who beat the living excrement out of the migrants. And Sicily, I mean, they have a lot of these migrants. It's also transitory location for them. But the migrants do not act in an obnoxiously criminal manner like they do elsewhere in Europe, because even if the Italian state will not crack down on non-white criminality on the Isle of Sicily, the state-type entity known as the Cosa Nostra will, because ultimately you are harassing their friends and neighbors and extortion base when you come in from Africa to start to mess around in Sicily.
Yeah, I definitely think that the weakness of liberal states today is one of the reasons that such criminality is allowed to get away with. But even then, I think that the weakness is often is actually deliberate, because the people in control do not have our interests in mind. But I think that we've probably covered the topic quite extensively. If anyone has any questions on Entropy, if you'd like to add any questions in Entropy, or if you'd like to make any donations, you can. Is there anything last you'd like to say before we finish, Nick?
Well, I want to reiterate my condemnation of illegal activity, and obviously anyone listening to this, don't think you can advance the cause of order, that you can advance the cause of the dissident right or of white well-being or all of our allied causes by criminality, or God forbid, advocating for criminality. I would also caution you to marshal your urges, right? We are learning to marshal our sexual urges. We're joining movements like NoFap and whatnot. Learn to marshal your violent urges. You have them. You're a man. Nothing to be ashamed of. And the best way to do it is to run them through some sort of hierarchical structure. Now, for the time being, such structures open to you are martial arts clubs, the military, and the police. Take your pick. Two of those I would strongly recommend you not join.
Don't
I
join the
have my
police if
reason,
if you're
right?
an American. Do not join the police.
Yeah,
Like
especially at this time, when it's basically legal for, black criminals to shoot at you and beat you and stab you with
yeah,
knives.
it's either go to jail for life. If a black guy attacks you, you can either go to jail for life or
Yeah.
get killed, basically.
Right. And the second reason is people are saying, oh, we should infiltrate the security services. And I say to them, yeah, but remember what not John Derbyshire, Theodore Dalrymple once said. When you repeat, you will be forced to repeat woke platitudes in order to keep your job and advance in your career. But when you repeat things you know to be untrue, you humiliate yourself and basically condition yourself to accept them. And this is the same reason why Pascal's wager works. If you act like a Christian long enough, you will eventually become a Christian. You will eventually sincerely believe in God, because the mind follows the body, not the other way around. And if you are performatively woke, as you have to be if you work for an American police department or even the American military, you will eventually genuinely start believing these things. You will start bargaining with yourself to hawk up the red pills. I mean, people don't believe that can happen to them, but it happens. Pascal's wager works. People go to church every Sunday, and 2-3 years later, they are essentially religious fanatics. And the same happens with woke. The same happens with American liberalism. So, look for a boxing gym, look for a kickboxing gym, Brazilian jiu-jitsu. And you can even join a gun club if you are in America. I believe gun ownership is still legal for the time being. Do find an outlet for your violent urges. Do not keep them bottled up. That's what leads to Fed posting.
Yeah, and I guess what I will say is that I definitely agree that for me, I just can't I just can't do the bullshit dance with the woke politics stuff. I don't know if I'll ever be able to work in one of these jobs because first of all, the problem would be if I get doxxed, which may just be when, if not if. I'm basically that career is going to basically be finished with. But yeah, I just for me, I just can't I just can't like parody something I know to be so completely false day in and day out. I'm just not someone that can do that. No, I'm not saying if you have a high position in one of these organizations, I think you should keep it. But I would definitely say that I agree with the notion that Pascal's wager can cause you to actually eventually start to believe the bullshit coming out of your mouth. What I'll say, I guess, on my last word on the question of the mafia. Well, I definitely stand by the points I made in the video. I definitely condemn criminality and things like that. The one thing that is interesting is because I did talk about in the video that there are a lot of right-wing themes in the mafia, the depiction of the mafia in pop culture, and there's many things that are right-wing about these organizations. So I don't think that it's necessarily something that I just blanketly condemn, because I do think there's lessons to learn from it. And I'd say having that kind of mindset, having the mindset of you're in this kind of you're no longer in, especially if you're in the United States or Canada, you're no longer in a society that is ultimately on your side and defending your interests, and that like the subversive elements are against you. It's that you are the outsider now. You are the dissident now. It is not your country anymore. And, kind of forming that kind of interest group, should not be something criminal, but kind of forming that group and like acting out politics in a way that benefits that group in kind of a dog-eat-dog, zero-sum game way of looking at power. That I think is the approach that the dissident right really needs to start taking, because ultimately our countries aren't ours anymore. And maybe if there's anything good you can learn from the mafia, it's that kind of mindset is one that, I think really needs to be employed by people in our sphere of politics, because ultimately, I do believe in things like lawfulness. I do believe in things like values and stuff, but as it exists today, those things are not, they're not in our favor. And, I'd say devoting yourself to abstract values that are not benefiting you is definitely not a winning strategy. So yeah, I'd say that's kind of my last word on the lessons that you can learn from gangsters and from the mafia and from, I guess, what is a very interesting aspect of pop culture. I will admit that I think that these films are cool. I definitely love the archetype. I definitely think that it's something that's really fascinating, and it's certainly an interesting topic to discuss from a dissident right perspective. And
I could spend hours talking about this. I have actually a lot of my articles on countercurrents are based on reverse engineering the mafia honor code into something that is useful to us. So one thing we can internalize definitely is omerta. Do not talk to outsiders about the business.
Do not talk to Antifa.
Do not talk to the mainstream media. Do not talk to police. Do not talk to federal agents. Learn to identify them. Another one is don't get angry. Get even. Okay, someone called you a Nazi incel online. Do not go spurg out. At best, you're just going to lose your Twitter handle. No, what you're going to do is we're going to work towards establishing, a white positive society, an orderly society. And that guy who thinks, he got one over you by calling you a Nazi incel, he either falls in line or gets, a fistful of order across his chops. We disavow illegal activity, but legitimate violence, legal violence, we avow. Right? Cracking down on criminals, we avow.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I definitely think that, having like a code of order within the dissident right is actually something that actually would be very beneficial. Like, anyone who talks to Antifa, gives any information, or does like an interview on the mainstream media, yeah, that's a no-no. I definitely agree with, because ultimately we are people who believe in hierarchy and believe in order, and the mainstream, the wider society is not providing that. I do think having an alternative structure which is able to introduce that into people's lives is really what people need at this point.
Right. Have we any super chats from Entropy?
No, I don't. We don't. So I think that's a good place to finish. So definitely check out Nick's article on In Defense of Gangs on countercurrents. I've linked that in the description. If you haven't seen my video yet on the Public Enemy, I would recommend that. I think it's one of my best personally. And check out a bunch of Nick's other articles on countercurrents. He does a lot of great work, and he's done several great podcasts with Greg Johnson. So definitely keep an eye out for those too. Anything last you'd like to say, Nick, before we finish?
Well, I want to say also I appear every Saturday at 9 p.m. CET. That's, I believe, 3 p.m. Eastern Standard Time on the Writer's Block with my friend and co-host Full Moon Ancestry, and also Dr. Greg Johnson, the editor of Countercurrents. And we field questions. We have fun. Some streams are more relaxed. Some are more intellectual. And beyond that, make sure to like, share, and subscribe to Endeavor. I greatly admired him. I admire him. Like, I wanted to put a disclaimer before we began that no matter our disagreements on this here topic, everyone should follow Endeavor. He represents a very important step forward in the in neo-reactionary thought. Which I mean, if you listened carefully, you'd notice that I too am very heavily influenced by neo-reactionary thought. And so, yeah, that's what I have to say.
Well, I appreciate those kind words. So thank you to everyone for watching, and have a good evening.
Bye-bye.